Shavua Tov, Parashat Tetzaveh. We will give a definition of humility that is perhaps one of the most life-changing and empowering definitions that you will hear. But let's take a look at the Parsha first and get into it. We start with the main topic of the Parsha, which is the magnificent garments of the high priest. He wears on his forehead the name of God in gold, tzitz, and he has on his breast, on his heart, the Choshen Mishpat with the 12 precious stones representing the 12 tribes of Israel. He was a magnificent sight. And one could ask, what is all of this aesthetics about? Is it really necessary? And how does wearing all of these glittery, shiny things reconcile with the Torah concept of humility? Isn't humility supposed to be a prime value? And yet we have this person dressing up in a way that was unparalleled. How does that connect to the concept of humility? Let's add another question from the Megillat Esther. We have the story of Esther, who becomes the queen, and Haman, who gets permission from the king to destroy the Jews, and Mordechai sends an urgent message to Esther. Esther, you must go to the king and tell him to nullify the homicidal murder of that evil Haman. And Esther says, wait a second. I can't do that. You see, the king has a rule that if you were not called to see him and you just show up, you are to be put to death. And I haven't been called for 30 days. Seems to me that the king is tired of me, doesn't like me anymore, and therefore if I were just to show up, he'd probably have me killed. The only time he breaks that rule is if he sees somebody and changes his mind and reaches out his royal scepter, and then that person can live. I haven't been called for a month. It's not looking good. So therefore, I'd rather not thank you. And Mordechai sends back to her one of the most sharply worded rebukes in the entire book. He says, do not imagine that you will survive from all of the Jews by virtue of the fact that you are in the palace. Because if you do not speak up now, if you are silent at this point, then salvation will surely arrive for the rest of the Jewish people, but you and your family will disappear. And then he comes with the final phrase, which is perhaps something that echoes throughout all of the generations and should guide us every day of our lives. He says to her the following, Umi yodea im la'et kazot higat lamalchut. Who knows? If not for this moment, you became the queen. In other words, says Mordechai to Esther, you have been put in this unique situation of tremendous potential to save the entire Jewish people. Perhaps the whole reason that you are there in the palace, the whole reason that you became the queen, is because of this exact moment. Will you seize it, or will you be silent and then pass away from the pages of history? A very, very powerful thing when you think about it. What exactly, though, is the content of this conversation? Why is Esther hesitating? It seems to be she's got good reasons to hesitate. But still, she is hesitating, and why does Mordechai not accept her explanations? We need to explain that as well. So let's go straight to the point. Humility. How does humility connect with the magnificent garments of the Kohen Gadol? And what is proper humility? There are two types of humility, says Rabbi Twersky. I will add my own description and say one of them is the humility that the evil inclination wants us to have, the anava shel yetzer hara. And the other one is the humility that the good inclination wants us to have, the anava shel yetzer hatov. What is the difference between the two of them? It is in the message that they say to the individual. The yetzer hara, the evil inclination, wants us to be humble in the following manner. You're no good, you're nothing, you're a failure, put your head down, go back to bed. In other words, the yetzer hara wants us to be silent, wants us to not do anything, not try anything, not to believe in ourselves, but rather to be convinced that we are worthless. That is, well, it's not really humility. It is the complete and total absence of self-esteem. And as Rabbi Twersky reminds us, self-esteem is critical for success in life in any way, shape, or form. But that is what the evil inclination wants us to say. What is the anava shel yetzer hatov, the humility of the good inclination? Well, this is a different animal altogether. The good inclination says to the person, you have so much potential. You have so great an arsenal of ability, and yet you don't use it. You're a failure because you don't do what you are capable of doing. Get off of your tuchis, pardon the expression, and get out there and do it. In other words, that the humility of the Yetzer HaTov is a catalyst and a motivation to create and do even greater and better things in the world. That's a huge difference. So does humility serve as an excuse to roll over and play dead, or does it serve as a catalyst to get up and play alive? Big, big difference. And Rabbi Twersky connects it to the very beginning of the Parsha, where we have the commandment for the Kohen to light the menorah. And what is he to light the menorah with? A special type of olive oil. It is called katit. The very first oil. You take the olive and you crush it, and then the first oil that comes out, that's the best oil. That oil has to be used to light the menorah in the Mishkan, in the sanctuary. And so Rabbi Twersky says, here you have humility. What is humility? Crushing that olive, knocking it down, but not knocking it down in a destructive fashion, but rather knocking it down and saying, look at you, look at this beautiful oil you just created. What are you going to do with it? You must use it to illuminate the world. Katit, if it has been crushed down, la ma'or. It must then illuminate. Use that humility to motivate to ever greater action. If that is the case, then perhaps we can now understand the discussion between Mordechai and Esther. Esther had the wrong type of humility. She was saying, the king doesn't like me, I can't convince him. I'm not somebody with the authority and the gravitas to change the king's mind. He hasn't paid attention to me for a month. So therefore, if I go in, I'm probably going to get killed. Seems to be a reasonable argument, but Mordechai says it's not. That is anava shel yetzer hara. That is the humility of the yetzer hara. The humility of the Yetzer HaTov says, "Umi yodea im la'et kazot higat lamalchut." Who knows if not for this moment you became the queen. You are the queen, Esther. You have tremendous ability to convince the king to change the course of history and save the entire Jewish people. Don't be silent. Don't listen to the Yetzer Hara. Listen to the Yetzer HaTov. Go and do it. And indeed, what happens? She shows up in the king's room. Before she even opens her mouth, the king is ready to grant her up to half of the kingdom. How small we sometimes are in our own eyes, and yet how great we can be if we were just to reach out and take action. That is the humility of the Yetzer HaTov. That is what must motivate us. And therefore I think that the clothing of the Kohen Gadol is not covering or hiding something to be embarrassed about, because that is the usual rule of clothing. Clothing hides our nakedness, and we wear it to cover up that about which we are embarrassed. And that comes straight back to Adam and Chava. After they ate from the tree of knowledge and began judging each other and themselves, they were embarrassed and they needed to be covered. But the clothing of the Kohen Gadol is different. It is not covering, it is revealing. It is revealing the magnificence of the Kohen's potential. He has on his head the tzitz, which is the divine name of God on his forehead. The great Rabbi Yosef Dov Soloveitchik, in his eulogy for the famous Rabbi Chaim Ozer Godzinski, nearly more than 80 years ago, in that eulogy said that the Kohen Gadol had two garments which were perhaps more prominent than others. One was indeed this tzitz, which he wore on his forehead, which had God's name on it, and the other was the breastplate, which had the 12 stones, precious stones representing the 12 tribes of Israel. A leader, said Rabbi Soloveitchik, has to have both the intellect, as symbolized by the tzitz on the head, the scholarship and the knowledge, and of course Reb Chaim Ozer Godzinski had that, but he also must have an abounding ahavas Yisrael, love of Israel, represented by the breastplate with the 12 stones representing the 12 tribes on his heart. They must be on his heart and in his heart and in his desire to do well all the days of his life. So therefore, the clothing of the Kohen Gadol shows the potential. The Kohen Gadol can be a tremendous scholar and can be a tremendous source of good deeds for the Jewish people. And we are all, in a sense, miniature Kohanim Gedolim. We have tremendous potential. Men wear something, well, they don't wear the Kohen Gadol's clothing, but they wear tefillin. One pair of tefillin goes on the forehead. Again, to show that we have the potential to become great scholars and to become very knowledgeable of Torah if we would just try. And also to use our intellect to change the world, to invent, to improve, to fix, to solve. And we also at the same time have tefillin shel yad, which is on our arm opposite the heart, to symbolize our deeds must be good, our heart must be pure, our love of our fellow Jew must be complete. And therefore we will do good deeds and we will do our best to improve the lot of our fellow. We have that potential within us. we have gotten to the point of kingdom because of that potential. Will we see it come through? Will we fulfill that tremendous potential? And that is the symbolism of the garments of the high priest. It does not cover and conceal, but rather it reveals our potential, what we can accomplish if we set our hearts to it. So, and there's just one other message to add to this, and that is we do this every day. Every day in this week's Parsha, it mentions not just the lighting of the menorah, which takes place every day, because every day we need new light, new direction, new motivation. Also, we bring the Tamid Shel Shachar Vein Arbaim, we bring the daily offerings mentioned in this week's Parsha. Why are they mentioned in this week's Parsha? They needed to be mentioned later on. In Bamidbar we mentioned them, in Pinchas. But why is it mentioned here? The great Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch explained, because, like we said last week, when we make the Mishkan, when we take physical action and do those good deeds, then the divine presence dwells among us. But that's not a one-off deal. It's not a one-shot thing that only happened once and then it was over. In other words, it needs to be a continuous process. Every day we have to rededicate that sanctuary by bringing that day's lighting of the menorah and that day's sacrifices, and then the divine presence is with us. Each day is its own thing. A person could also be tempted with false humility to look back at their past as if it were a series of failures. I don't know if I like that. I heard once from a non-Jewish person, one of the great minds of the entrepreneurial world, a fellow by the name of Dan Sullivan, a very empowering sentence. And he says, there's no such thing as a failure. There's just research and development. In other words, if things didn't go well yesterday, well, instead of looking at it as being a failure and then listening to the falsehood's humility and saying, you see, I can't accomplish anything, why bother? No, look at it as if it were research and development. I learned something yesterday. I learned how not to do stuff, and therefore my humility says I have potential to do it a lot better. I will. With that thought in mind, when we rise up every morning and say to ourselves, perhaps for this reason we have become the queen, as it were, we have tremendous potential. Let each day see the fulfillment of that potential as much as possible, and keep the humility of the Yetzer HaTov in our hearts to strive ever and ever higher. Shavua Tov.